Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. In Jeremiah chapter 12, we have Jeremiah's prayer in verses 1 through 6, and then God's answer to his prayer in verse 7 through 13. And basically, Jeremiah is wondering why the Lord doesn't go ahead and enact justice. He's seeking God to come down and enact vengeance against his enemies. This might be prompted by what went on in chapter 11, where the Lord revealed to Jeremiah that there was a plot against his life. Jeremiah was unaware of it, but again, the Lord made it known to him, and apparently it was these men of Anathoth who were seeking his life. And maybe this prompted Jeremiah to give this prayer. But this is a very helpful chapter for more than one reason. For one, it kind of makes us have to sit back and think, yes, Jeremiah was wanting swift and quick justice for God to come in and destroy his enemies right away. And of course the Lord answers and says that is coming in time. But we have to think about, what if, would we really want that? As we look at the world situation, of course we would want the Lord to act swiftly, but think about a world where God just immediately destroyed evil as soon as it appeared. How long would you and I stand if God were to do that? God is a patient God, and He knows that things need to be done in a right way, but also in a timely way, and He always does the right things at the right time. And this is a good thing for us to understand and to realize, not only as we think about world events, but even in our personal lives when things happen, we need to just recognize that God does things in the right time. So that could be like a general lesson we could walk away with. But I wanted to look at a specific statement in Jeremiah chapter 12 that I think can apply to us as Christians in particular. In verse 2 he says, "You have planted them, they have also taken root. They grow, they have even produced fruit. You are near to their lips, but far from their mind." Now this is very similar to what Isaiah 29 and verse 13 states. And Jesus actually quotes from that Isaiah 29:13 in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 8. And he applies it to the first century Jews who were going by tradition rather than going by God's word. They were basically saying, if you want to, instead of giving something to your parents to help them out, you could say, well, I want to give it to God, so I don't have to honor my parents. And Jesus said, you dishonor God's law by keeping your tradition. And then he quotes Isaiah 29:13, again, which is very similar to Jeremiah 12:2 that we're reading today. And the idea is that they are speaking words of worship, of praise to God. They speak as though they honor God and that they hold God in high esteem, but their hearts and their minds are very far away from God. And that's very evident in the way that they act. With the first century Jews that Jesus was speaking to, it was because they were putting their tradition over God's law. Here in Jeremiah chapter 12, what's being referred to here is their deeds, the fact that they were involved in wickedness and evil. Yes, they would come to the temple, perhaps, and maybe worship the Lord. Maybe they'd even still use statements with the Lord's name in it. The Lord be with you, or make vows by the name of the Lord, and do those sorts of things. But their lives were very, very much disconnected to God. And even their minds were disconnected from Him. And so this ought to be something that we should take to heart as well. Because we may not go to the extreme that the people of Jeremiah's time did, in that we may not be going out and oppressing the orphan and the widow and other things and practicing these obvious, blatant acts of wickedness. But it might be that our hearts are still far away from the Lord. It might be that we don't really live a life where our heart is directed to God, where we are closely knitted with Him, walking in communion with Him, and all week long perhaps our minds are very, very distant from God. And then when we come to worship Him, perhaps on Sunday, and we're worshiping Him with our lips, or we're speaking the words of honor and praise to Him, really our minds are far away somewhere else. And it's because we've created a habit of having our minds drift away from God from so much that when we enter into worship with Him, with God's people, our minds are still very much away from Him. And not only in church, but in other times where we might be listening to Christian music, spiritual music, and we might be mouthing the words, but we're not really paying attention to what's being said, and we're not really engaged in what's being said. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul talks about the importance of singing with the mind, along with the Spirit. He says in verse 14, he says, "For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful." So even praying in a tongue with the Spirit engaged wasn't fruitful unless the mind was engaged as well. So he says you need the Spirit and the mind. In verse 15, what is the outcome then? "I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the mind also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the mind also." And so the idea here is that when we worship the Lord, our minds need to be engaged. We need to be thinking about the Lord, thinking about His majesty, His greatness, focused upon what is being said in the song. Or if you're praying to the Lord and you're praying a prayer to Him, to be thinking about what you're saying, not just mouthing repetitious statements that you're not really even thinking about, you just say them because that's what you always say, but to have your mind engaged while praying, and have your mind thinking about God as you're praying to Him. In John chapter 4, in verse 23, this is what Jesus told the woman at the well. He says, "But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be His worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth." So two things mentioned here by the Lord. And I believe these two things actually have a connection to what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, that of the mind and the spirit. When we are singing to the Lord, or we're praying to the Lord, and we're speaking words of truth, our mind has to recognize those truths. We have to be thinking about those truths and have those truths fresh in our minds, and to be thinking about them. But in our spirit, we are engaging the truth with faith. And so the Spirit supplies the faith, the mind supplies the truth, and that together, cumulatively, it produces the worship. So that we are taking the truths of God's Word in a song or in a prayer, and we're meeting that in our spirit with faith, and out comes this worship, the worship that God is desiring. And so that God no longer wants, or He really never has wanted, people who just use the lips to honor Him and praise Him, because anyone can do that and it not even mean anything. We need really these two most important things, the spirit and the mind, engage in worship, and many times we'll also use the lips. The lips can be useful in praising the Lord as our minds are thinking about the truth, and as our spirit meets that truth with faith. It can proceed forth through our lips and go out to go to the Lord in the form of worship. But we need all these things in place. And so when you worship God, whether it's at home or at church or wherever you are, in your car, make sure that you have your mind engaged, that your mind is not far away from the Lord, but that your mind is intent on thinking about Him, thinking about what you're saying, and then your spirit engages well by meeting that in faith, And I think you'll see that your worship will be a whole lot more meaningful. It'll definitely be more appreciated by God, but it'll also be more meaningful to you. So let's just think about that. Let's think about how we can do that in our worship to make our worship more acceptable to the Lord and more beneficial to us. Well, thank you guys for listening in today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.